Hello, my name is Denise Ann. I am the Connectional Ministries intern at the Connectional Table, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar, 5 Things to Know About the U.S. as a Regional Conference before General Conference 2020. Before we start, you should know that all attendees are muted during this webinar, and so we invite you to ask questions using the Q&A box. If you are having trouble with the webinar functions, please use the chat feature and I can help to troubleshoot. You will be receiving an email within the next few days from Zoom with a recording of the webinar, and the video will also be available on social media platforms at UMC CT next week. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Judy Keniston.
Hello, I am Judy Keniston, and I'm chair of the U.S. Contextual Ministries Committee of the Connectional Table, and I will be your moderator today. In this webinar, the panelists will be answering frequently asked questions that we have had about the CT legislation from presentations that we have given and questions that were submitted when the webinar was announced. Our speakers with us today are Benedita Pinicella Namdio, who is the chair of the Connectional Tables Working Group on the Worldwide Nature of the Church, and she is from Mozambique, but joining us from Zambia today. Karen Prudente is a Connectional Table member and has served on the U.S. Contextual Ministries Committee, and she is joining us from the Philippines today. Michelle Hetman is a Connectional Table member from the Southeastern jurisdiction, and Dale Jones is the Westpath Managing Director for Church Relations. All of these folks have been involved in the preparation of the legislation that the CT has prepared for the General Conference. Briefly, before we begin with our panel, I want to introduce the legislation for the U.S. Regional Committee, for the U.S. Regional Conference. Our Connectional Tables Working Group was tasked with finding a way for the U.S. churches to accomplish the adaptable work that is required by the proposed General Book of Discipline. This new discipline would have sections that are non-adaptable and parts that are adaptable. The adaptable and non-adaptable parts will be determined by the General Conference. Some of the areas of adaptation that we looked at are pensions, property concerns, and educational requirements, and we will be addressing those a little further in our conversations. Our work has been going on formally since 2013, when a task force on the worldwide nature of the church was formed to work with the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters and their work on the General Book of Discipline. Our work is not a response to the 2019 special session of General Conference, nor was it intended to address the impasse around the current language in the discipline. While some were lumped in a group of plans for General Conference 2020, our work was intended to ease the burden of the U.S. legislation at General Conference and to provide parity for the U.S. with the central conferences in terms of being able to adapt the adaptable parts of the Book of Discipline. Through this legislation, the U.S. Regional Conference will comprise the current U.S. jurisdictional conferences and the geographical boundaries congruent with the territory of the U.S. annual conferences. It will not change the role and authority of the jurisdictional conferences, including the election of bishops. The legislation is designed to help unburden the General Conference from dealing with U.S.-only matters and move our connection away from U.S. centrism in our governance. If you haven't had a chance to look at the legislation that is proposed, much of it can be found in the Conferences section of the ADCA, Volume 2, Section 1, in pages 312, 323 to 325, and pages 373 to 374. Those petition numbers are on your screen. The proposal would allow for 2 stages, which we will discuss more fully. And an important point to note is that Stage 1 committee does not require constitutional amendments, but it does require that anything passed by this committee is also approved by the General Conference. Stage 2 would create a regional conference structure for the United States, and that does require constitutional amendments. The proposal is designed to be implemented in those two stages, and because constitutional amendments needed to create a U.S. regional conference would require passage first by the General Conference and then ratification by the annual conference, the first stage allows for decisions to be made in that interim time. So we'll turn to our panel now to discuss some questions again that we have had. And if you have questions, I will remind you that you can ask those in the appropriate place. I'm going to turn first to Benedita, who is, as I said, joining us from Zambia today. Benedita, can you tell us more about the stages that were used to create the U.S. regional conferences, and also how soon they would take effect, and why two stages?
Thank you, Judy, for these questions, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Put it simply, stage one, just to form a committee of the General Conference with legislative functions that will deal with U.S. regions, adaptable disciplinary provisions, U.S.-related relations, and non-disciplinary petitions concerning U.S. matters. That's to say, all petitions that have nothing to do with central conferences, or which are not global. And stage two will come in effect after stage one, and after stage one and its work. There is a chart where we can see the please.
I think we're having a little problem with Benedita's audio. Dale, would you like to take a shot at explaining the chart a little bit?
Okay, the chart shows the two different stages that Judy mentioned earlier. The first stage that just establishes a committee whose work would still need to be ratified or affirmed by the General Conference. That is envisioned, however, to be an interim or a temporary stage if the second stage of the legislation is adopted. The second stage would create a body that would actually have legislative authority for those matters that are adaptable regionally or locally, and for matters that are specific to the church in the United States. So the timeline that you see here indicates that if the first stage could be enacted at the 2020 General Conference, and that first meeting of the U.S. committee could occur immediately prior, say, to the 2024 General Conference. The second stage would, if it is approved by the 2020 General Conference, then it would go through the constitutional amendment process that you see on the lower part of the chart there, with those amendments being out to the annual conference sessions in 2020, 2021, 2022, and then if approved, that body would be able to function, say, immediately on the heels of the 2024 General Conference, as would be the earliest that it might meet.
Thank you, Dale. Would you talking through a little bit of the process that the CT went through to shape this legislation?
The process I think came out of initially, Judy, the advisory group that you lead on U.S. contextual ministries, out of a realization that as the General Book of Discipline work moved forward, there simply was no venue in the church today for the U.S. to handle matters that are adaptable or specific to the U.S. other than the international body of the General Conference. So the advisory group set out to create a process whereby the U.S. could handle the matters that it would be responsible for amending and adapting without having to impose those on the entirety of the General Conference. And that involved in working with a number of individuals and groups in the central conferences and in the United States. We at WestPath got very much involved in it because this gives us a venue where U.S. benefit plan legislation can be handled without being put in front of the entire international body of the General Conference. And then as the proposal developed, it was vetted, presented to, and vetted with, and received input from directors of connectional ministries, from the conference chancellors, from the Council of Bishops, with the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. There were meetings held with the Rules Committee of the Commission on the General Conference and other groups to get as wide input and make sure that we were considering all the things that needed to be considered in the development of the legislation.
Thank you, Dale. Benedita, I'm going to go check. We're going to check your audio again. I'm interested to know what the extent of the international input was in writing this legislation. And if you're still here, I'd love to hear that from you. Benedita, is your audio there? I'm afraid either we're not hearing her or she's not hearing us, but we'll try to get that working. Michelle, could you tell us what's the wording behind the regional? Why is the U.S. Regional Conference name?
Yeah, of course. So there was a lot of conversation around the naming of what should go into a name and what kind of is in a name. And we recognize that in the U.S. there is a deep history of racism and hurt and harm behind the central jurisdiction that was present in our history, and decided that rather than moving forward and naming it the same, a U.S. Central Conference, we wanted to be really careful about that language and wanted to continue to acknowledge our racist history. And we realized that it would just be better to go ahead and call it a U.S. Regional Conference rather than a Central Conference for that reason.
Thank you. And Dale, you mentioned WestPath and their participation. What was the WestPath's role in crafting the legislation?
We started by doing research into various proposals that have been developed over the years for a model for governance of U.S. matters. We found that actually went back a lot farther than we thought, with the very first proposal of this type being almost 100 years ago. And then we looked at the more recent efforts in 2008, 2016, and what some of the challenges and issues that they ran into were, and then from that developed kind of some concepts and proposals and a kind of an initial draft of the two different stages, and then put that out to a larger group for input and feedback and refinement. We were blessed to have a person with some previous connectional table experience, Cynthia Dopke, join our staff as this effort was getting underway. And so Cynthia brought some excellent experience and history to this that she and I and a few others continued to work on and work in partnership with the connectional table in developing it.
And Cynthia had worked with the connectional table in the early stages, so she was an ideal person to have that connection with West.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Benedita, I'm going to try you again and see if we can get your sound working here. We'd still love to hear what the extent of the international input into the writing of this legislation is, and love to hear from you.
It looks like Benedita's audio is still not working.
I can see her trying to tell us things, but I'm not hearing her. And she's not muted from her perspective, it looks like, but we'll try to work on that. Karen, you've been, I know it's evening there for you in the Philippines. We want to bring you in here. We'd had, back in November, the Council of Bishops met, and the Central Conference College of Bishops stated that they would promote and solidly support the U.S. Regional Conference proposal. So can you tell us a little bit about some of that reaction from the Central Conference College of Bishops?
Sure, that meeting was held in Lake Junaluska, North Carolina last November, and there were at least 15, I think, or 17 Central Conference bishops who were there and had heard a presentation regarding the U.S. Regional Conference, and they find that regionalism is very important, and having the U.S. at par on equity is very important, and they're very supportive of it, actually. In fact, I go back into Nairobi this March to meet with the College of Bishops in Africa and to remind them of their covenant and pledge to support this this proposal.
And how have you seen and how have the Central Conferences shown their support for the plan?
The Central Conferences are supportive of having the U.S. at the same level as the United States. And also during General Conference, it would also enable the U.S. matters to just be held within the group of U.S. Regional Conference and not be part of the total General Conference. So this is very supportive. It saves time, perhaps even money, let's call it that, so that the General Conference is shortened.
The CT, as we were going through the process, we made great efforts to make sure things were translated and so that in the written materials were available in all of our languages. And we feel that that's been helpful for, as we've gone through the process, for the Central Conferences to be part of reacting to what it was proposed, and also helped us take questions and suggestions throughout the writing process. And we appreciate those persons who have helped get the responses that it helped us to form the legislation as it goes forward. I want to go to a couple of questions that we had that have come in prior to us coming to the webinar. Michelle, I'm going to toss you a hard one. What will the U.S. Regional Conference cost? Won't it be more money?
Yeah, so we don't know the exact costs and figures right now. We won't really know that until this happens. But we do believe that it will actually save money. Like Dale said, we would hope that, well, the plan would be that this would meet either at the beginning or the end of the general conference meeting time. So that would save on any additional flights. We would only have one flight for the participants, for our delegates, and then also a smaller gathering would mean, less money, less food, less hotel rooms. So the larger general conference would be meeting for a shorter period of time. So we really do believe that this is a good way to be good stewards of our resources by saving money in our general conference time.
There's been some concern also that the scope or definition of what the regional conference would handle is not tightly defined enough. It was the connectional table's assumption that that would be defined by general conference, and also part of the way that we added to the legislation to help make that clearer is by putting central conference members on the committee and the regional conference. Do you have any comments that, Michelle, that you would have responses to how we might, how you might answer the question of how we could decide what is held, what is the, how we define what goes into the regional conference?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of this we left out of, not left out of the legislation, but we left up to the general conference body because we as the connectional table, this was our mandate, but we didn't want to come in and say, this is exactly how everything is going to play out. So a lot of this really does allow for the general conference to make those decisions as the legislation is being worked and being discussed. Like you said, on the U.S. Regional Committee, there will be one lay and one clergy person from each central conference. And we believed that that was just a really important way to have all voices at the table. And especially in that transition, kind of in the interim time between the U.S. committee in stage 1 and the actual regional conference being formed in stage 2, to be able to have all of those voices. Because central conference members do have this structure right now. So we think that their voice and their expertise in that area would be really helpful as this is getting off the ground.
We're having several questions that are coming in now and also that we've had prior. Obviously, our legislation was developed as it's printed in the ADCA way prior to the protocol and the protocol agreement. And one of the questions that has come up since that has happened is what can and can't be done to speed up the process, and how does the legislation interact with the protocol? I'll throw that out to whomever would like to weigh in on that. We have that question frequently, and I'm looking as we have questions coming in, some more questions about that.
I can start, and then whoever else wants to jump in can go for it. So right now, the U.S. as a regional conference legislation is written so that it would be fully in effect by 2024. So like we said, the first stage can happen without any constitutional amendments. But as we know, we have to go then through voting in annual conferences. So that takes the time that we wouldn't be able to be in effect until 2024. However, if delegates wanted to propose amendments, I think being really creative it's a time for us to be creative with our legislation and with our kind of governance together. So if there were amendments made, it would be possible that the U.S. Regional Committee could meet at the 2020 General Conference. But the way that the legislation is written right now, that is not the way that it's written. Let's see, if someone else wants to jump in with the rest.
Karen, if you would go ahead with fill in what you'd like to answer there, and also if you'd like to take us to how does this legislation relate to other plans in addition to the protocol?
Sure. Let me start with the protocol. So there is a term within the protocol that talks about regionalism, and it is just in general terms. So that is one thing regarding the protocol. So in a way, U.S. Regional Conference is a complement, let's call it that, to the protocol. However, there is a new proposal, which is really more about restructuring the church called the Christmas Covenant. And that legislation was approved here in the Philippines last week, but has not publicly shared the document. But it does move up, based on what Michelle was saying, the dates of what the U.S. Regional Conference has not been enabled to do. So it brings it up actually 2 years ahead of time. That is what the Christmas Covenant does regarding U.S. Regional Conference. But it keeps it at parity, as we've said at the beginning, with all the regional conferences. So it is a complement basically to the protocol, and it is actually an expansion of the U.S. Regional Conference within the regional conference concept, a global regional conference concept.
I would just offer one additional thought, that the protocol and some of the prior plans anticipate the possibility of multiple Methodist denominations or multiple Methodist expressions going forward. If to the extent that that any of those new Methodist entities are global entities, it seems to make sense to me that they would need both global and regional governance, and that that the model that the U.S. Regional Conference legislation provides could be applicable in any of those scenarios of new denominations that may form.
We've had a question about how the General Conference decides what's included and what is not proper business for the U.S. Regional Conference. We have a process now that puts legislation into its proper places, and that our intention was for that process to be used, the process of our petition secretary assigning petitions. We also would use the other General Conference options of moving legislation to the place that's most appropriate. And we also, as a way to make sure that the legislation that has been deemed U.S. specific is actually that, we would have two Central Conference members from every Central Conference as part of the committee, and then the Regional Conference, who would be able to say, this could have implications in Central Conferences that we are not acknowledging here. So that was our intention. Obviously, that would be left up to the General Conference. And as we're looking in this area, I'd like to ask another question that has come up frequently, and that's does the General Conference really spend that much time on U.S. focused matters? And I think I'll let Dale attack that question.
Well, I think it spends too much time on U.S. focused matters. We're bringing it from WestPath a major benefit plan change, and under the current governance model, that has to go to the General Conference. We'll use 45 minutes of plenary time explaining that that new benefits plan coming to really just to the U.S., but that the entire General Conference will have to understand and make a decision and vote on. The national plans are major areas emphasis and importance, the 6 national plans for Korean ministry, Hispanic, Latino ministry, all the 6 national plans, but that, for the U.S. and in fact have been responsible for growth in the ethnic churches in the U.S. But they are national plans, and so they don't really involve the church beyond the United States. Matters of even the trust clause, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent times in the situation in the church, are understood and enacted differently in different parts of the world where the laws don't necessarily align with property laws and real estate laws and that kind of thing as they do in the United States. So yes, I would say the General Conference spends too much time on U.S.-centric legislation. Michelle talked about the meeting cost. In 2012, for example, our agency presented 2 major benefit plans that occupied, one of them 74 pages of the ADCA and another one 77 pages, 150 pages of the ADCA. And this was just 2 pieces of legislation that then had to be translated into all the languages of the General Conference and understood by the people who spoke those languages and then voted on and enacted. So there are additional costs, I think, for interpretation and translation and other matters that would be saved and prevented, along with just the overall efficiency, if those things could be handled by a U.S.-based body. I think we could look at, Denise could probably show us some slides that have a myriad number of examples of U.S.-centric legislation, if we want to take a moment to look at those.
Do you have those for us, Denise Ann? And while we're waiting, Benedito, let's try your sound again and see if we can have a reaction, your reaction to that. I know we've talked on many occasions, so I know you have lots of examples. Benedita, if it's easier for you to maybe type into the chat, that would, not sure why we're not able to hear you. We heard you at the beginning. And you can see on your screen now some of the legislation in the past that Dale was referring to.
This listing of about 40 different petitions comes out of just a quick overview that one of my coworkers did of the 2016 ADCA. So it's probably not by any means an exhaustive listing, but you can see there are some matters that are of substantive importance to the United States, but not necessarily significant at all for the rest of the world.
I have another question, a follow-up question to our to an earlier statement about how the U.S. how the General Conference would decide what was U.S. related, and the question asks that it was states it's unclear where the Central Conferences have freedom to adapt that the U.S. doesn't have. At the current time, the Central Conference is only limited by the things that are not that it is not able to adapt, and that includes our restrictive rules, the Constitution. That it has, and there's a specific list of things that they can't adapt, and everything else pretty much they can. Now, the new General Book of Discipline intention is there will be very clearly defined adaptable and non-adaptable parts. So at that point, then it's much easier to see what the U.S. can adapt and what is non-adaptable for the entire church. Now, when we were working on the legislation, our assumption and the intention of the Committee on Central Conference Matters is that the General Book of Discipline would be presented in 2020. It's not going to be completed by then, and so we're only going to be seeing a draft of their work. But I think that where they have divided the sections for adaptable and non-adaptable will be clear for the General Conference 2020 delegates. So I think we'll have a much better idea of the intentions of those that are preparing the General Book of Discipline, so that we would know that. As it is currently, Central Conferences can adapt anything that they are not restricted from adapting at this point. And if anybody'd like to clarify that, that's fine too. Karen, I know you've done a lot of work on this.
On the non-disciplinary, I'm sorry. Well, they're pretty straightforward, the non-disciplinary portions, the petitions within the U.S. Regional Conference, basically on just how to organize the U.S. Regional Conference interim-wise, and until it becomes a formal U.S. Regional Conference after the ratification that goes via all the annual conferences globally. Of course, once the General Conference approves the U.S. Regional Conference. So, one of the disciplinary actions basically is just to request about $83,000 to $98,000 for the operation of the interim committee in the meantime. So that is pretty much the financial implication of this non-disciplinary petition within the U.S. Regional Conference proposal.
I want to share one of Benedita's responses that she is sharing her experience as a Central Conference delegate and wondering what the relevance of some petitions were to the global church and why they were voting on issues that were out of their context. She said she vividly remembers once discussing the Battle Hymn of the Republic and should the United Methodist hymnal, whether the Battle Hymn of the Republic should be in the United Methodist hymnal. And for delegates who don't have the understanding of American history, this discussion was very US-centric and made no sense. So Central Conferences where delegates were invited to take sides and felt like pawns just being used as weights on a scale to shift the balance from one side to the other. This is definitely one of the areas, and I'm now using those were Benedita's words. My own thoughts is that this is definitely one of the ways that we have disenfranchised our Central Conference, these kinds of conversations, and that's one of the goals of this legislation. Again, I'm going to come to Michelle because we've had a lot of questions about how this would impact the discussion around LGBTQ language, and is this a way just to get around the impact of 2019 legislation?
Yeah, so like we mentioned before, this conversation and this legislation, this team has been meeting far before February 2019. So this is not a reaction from our special session of General Conference, but really, like Judy mentioned in the beginning, goes back to 2013. With that being said, so this is not addressed in our legislation. This was not the purpose of our legislation. It is a huge question, obviously still for everyone though. So based on the current Book of Discipline, this is not in the non-adaptable portion like we were just talking about. So no, this would not address or allow for full inclusion simply by passing the U.S. regional conference legislation. If things were changed so that the non-adaptable portion would allow for LGBTQ inclusion and same-gender loving marriages, then yes. But like we said, this is our legislation is not addressing this directly. The intention is to be able to be better stewards of everyone's time, to, like we said, bring the U.S. in parity with the structure of central conferences, being able to do more contextualized ministry. But it is still very important, regardless of anything, that we have this U.S. regional conference to be able to move forward. Like we said, there are lots of moving parts. So as other things shift and as we make other changes to our legislation and to our book of discipline and social principles, then things could line up and there could be changes that happen.
We've had a question that asked, and we want to be careful to be specific to our legislation, but we have a lot of questions because I think the assumption is that this legislation may be adapted by other plans and groups. And one of the questions is dealing with the timing at General Conference and the understanding that a vote would need to be taken to determine what the direction of the church is before we would vote on anything else. Again, with this point is we don't know if the rules will be changed to do legislation differently. And we are moving ahead on the assumption that we will be dealing with General Conference under the current rules. So such recommendations could come from the Commission on the General Conference and be adopted by the entire plenary. But we feel our legislation would be helpful to the church, regardless what form the church takes following General Conference 2020. And so if our legislation is useful to other plans, that would be great, but that is not that we are not affiliating with any plan for that specific reason. Are there other responses and other panelists who would like to add to that?
I'd like to concur with what you said, Judy. Basically, when this legislation was written, it was basically to, in a way, save mission money, save time, and be efficient. This has no response to what happened in 2019. So people need to be very clear about what the U.S. Regional Conference proposal is.
Thank you, Karen. Dale, I'm going to ask you, because this question is kind of a turnaround question from some of the ones that we've had. But if with a U.S. regional conference, we had a regional conference for the U.S., then what does General Conference do?
It looks like Dale may be muted as well.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Then General Conference would be freed up to deal with those matters that are truly global, that are important, whether they pertain to the U.S. or to the Philippines or to Africa or to Europe or wherever. The things that would be of importance and interest to the entirety of the church we would still need a General Conference because there are those things, and the General Conference though would be free to do those. It could spend its time perhaps more productively and more missionally and strategically to enable us to have a greater witness in the world on a global basis and move forward the work of Methodism globally, while the regional bodies continue to deal with those things that are specific to their areas.
I believe the General Conference would still have a good bit of work to do. I would hope that, and that this would allow us to be more truly global in our perspective.
Yeah, we don't get down to a one-day meeting just by creating a regional conference, but we might well shave several days off of the current General Conference.
We've also received a question that the United Methodist Church has structures that allow similar levels of authority from General Conference to jurisdictional and central conferences and then to annual conferences. There is a concern that this is a different level in the United States that has no parallels elsewhere. So why not give the functions authority of the legislation to creating to all jurisdictional and central conferences to avoid the, just to make that an easier transition. And there is legislation for that. Can you address why we moved to the one U.S. regional conference rather than jurisdictional divisions? I'll throw that to anybody on the panel.
I'll just start by offering that there are some things I think that the U.S. as a nation would want to deal with, apart from doing that in five separate entities. There are U.S. Social and environmental matters that the church may want to weigh in as a unit, and then missionally, there are national mission efforts. We mentioned earlier the national plans. Those are, I think, well handled at a national level rather than at each jurisdictional level, and give some synergy that we would not have if every jurisdiction had to have its own national plans for ethnic ministry, and then even the benefit plans, the area that affects us at Westpath. It's far more practical to have one body that can make the decisions for the U.S. church, as opposed to having that done in maybe five different settings.
I'd also like to weigh in. I agree with Dale. In the central conferences, the jurisdictional level that we have in the United States is really equivalent to the episcopal areas that we have. And yet, and then we call them central conferences in currently right now in all around the world, except within the United States. And this is why it's also important, because then the US has to go to General Conference. So by creating the US Regional Conference, we save not only time, but also certain legislation that does not have to go to the global body.
Michelle, did you, and you may have said this earlier, when talking about the name of the regional conference, why it was regional conference and in not just calling it central conference? There are legislative proposals to make the U.S. a central conference, and we had some discussion with that within our connectional table. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so like we said, and this can be a little confusing. I mean, I guess it would make more sense if we just called it a central conference. But within the CT body, I mean, we had a lot of discussion around how it would not feel just if we called it a central conference because of the history of the central jurisdiction in the United States. So think of the U.S. regional. I mean, yes, that is. It's essentially the same. Just the language is important, and the name was important to call it a regional conference instead of a central conference.
The word central was extremely problematic for a lot of the CT members and people who experienced the racial injustice that the church perpetuated through the central jurisdiction, and we really wanted to stay away from any image of that in the legislation. Also, central conferences have more authority than jurisdiction. So that all the roles and authority that are missing from the jurisdictional conferences and that central conferences have, we're really not talking about another layer of structure here, but a way to unburden the general conference from serving. So a regional conference would allow the United Methodist Church members in the U.S. to speak on one voice on certain issues, such as that are of national importance, that we now do from general conference, but we would be able to have an actual regional statement voice of statement, and we felt that would also be important. One question we received, and I would like to just make this correction if we didn't make this clear, whether central conferences don't have vote in the new U.S. body, while the U.S. representation is heavily, it's featured heavily in the standing committee, although it is the minority in the standing committee on central conference matters. I just want to make clear that this committee isn't a reflection of the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. We looked at that in designing the plan, but there are differences between them. It's different. Originally, the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters met only at General Conference, and they only considered the petitions that come from Central Conference Matter. Then that legislation would come to a vote for the entire General Conference. Just then, that is a similarity to the committee, the stage one part of our committee. But that legislation in stage two, and we have allowed for the participation. So there are voice and vote in that committee of Central Conference members. So I just want to make that distinction and make that correction, because the question seems to indicate that there are not. What about the timing? Karen, will you talk to us a bit about what's the right time for this legislation? Because we had a lot of discussion about this in right before we finished developing the legislation and presented it for the General Conference. There was definitely an idea that perhaps we should wait, since there's a lot of turmoil in the church, but the connectional table decided to go ahead with this legislation. And would you speak to us just a little bit about the timing and why we feel this is the right time?
Well, as we're going through the concept of restructuring the church, I think it's time also that the U.S. really consider regionalism, because the world has been ready for it. So it's really been waiting for the U.S. really to come aboard the whole concept of regionalism. And this is the right moment. So the central conferences have been ready. It's just, has the U.S. been ready? And we're hoping that this is the time that our annual conferences are ready to accept this new structure of bringing us at this point to this table.
Thank you. Someone has asked us what's the likelihood of the regional conference being adopted at General Conference. Not sure who wants to do the prediction, be in prediction mode here. I think there are a number of possible outcomes for General Conference 2020, and it's difficult for us to predict what will be adopted, but we're hopeful that the regional conference would be adopted so that the constitutional amendments can be approved, and we will be in a place when the General Book of Discipline is completed, that we would be able to move forward more quickly. There's also been a question about some of the talking points that we have, and we will, at the end of the webinar, give you access to our website. There is a website for the regional conference, and we have our talking points and a lot of the things that we've been discussing, and including the link for this webinar afterwards. will be available there. So if you feel the need for that communication, we realize there's a lot of distrust in the church, and we want to make those things clear. We've also had a question that about the General Book of Discipline and when it would be available, and I do not know the answer to that. The whole book will not be available at this General Conference because it isn't completed yet. But I believe that they will be reporting to the General Conference on their progress, and that's all I know for that that information.
The draft, I believe, is already published in the ADCA. So if people want to read what the current thinking of the Standing Committee is on the General Book of Discipline, I think you can find that in the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate.
Okay, thank you, Dale. That's helpful. There's a question here, Dale. I'm going to let you take this one. What's the makeup of the committee in stage 1, and who selects them?
The legislation calls for the committee, the stage 1 committee, to be the delegates from the U.S. annual conferences to the General Conference. So it's a very large, kind of a super committee in one sense, and it would be made up of everyone who is elected as a General Conference delegate from annual conferences in the U.S. That's also the makeup of the U.S. regional conference body. So it's essentially the same people that would be participating in these decisions if they had to stay at the solely at the General Conference level. That would be handling them through the committee and through the U.S. Regional Conference.
The Central Conference members would be selected by either the Central Conference or a group that would make that decision. That was at the request of Central Conference members of the CT. They felt that was a fairer way to make sure that they have representation. Okay, I'm looking through the questions that have come in. I want to go back and see if I'm just going to check Benedita again to see if we have some time, because I did want for her to be able to weigh in on the extent of the international input and some of the reaction there. And if we can't hear you, then we'll let you type a response, and I'll read it to everyone. So you want to try your mic again?
We still can't hear you, Benedita. Maybe you can unmute on your computer. Benedita?
Okay, I'll let Denise Ann work on that for a little bit. I'm really sorry that we haven't been able to hear Benedita. She's done so much work on this with us, and has been a wonderful leader for the working group with the Connectional Table on the worldwide nature of the church. And so I'm really sorry that we're not getting her voice here, but I do want to thank her for all the contributions she's made to get us to this point. Karen, you've been involved recently with the development and with the Christmas Covenant, and you've also been there in the Philippines at some of the annual conferences that are meeting. Would you like to just share a little bit about the reaction, and also the work, how that group sees the relationship with our work with the the regional conference?
So the Christmas Covenant was published in general with a preamble in December, right during the Christmas period. And it was from the central conferences that developed legislation, and it's about global regionalism, but incorporated pretty much all of the U.S. Regional Conference proposal from the connectional table into the Christmas Covenant plan, but has even given it more strength, actually, so that the U.S. would really be at par, even legislatively, in the sense of language, right, through the Christmas Covenant. And as I've shared, there are at least 15 central conferences that are part of that writing team of the Christmas Covenant, and wanted to ensure that the United States would also have parity, equity in that legislation.
And one of the things that I know that you are familiar with is the endorsement of the Philippine bishops for the U.S. regional plan. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, so at its, they have a council that meets every November also, the Council of Bishops, and not only the Council of Bishops, but also the Philippine delegation of 52 have endorsed the U.S. Regional Conference as part of, on its own, and also via the Christmas Covenant, just recently last week. So there is definitely support from the full delegation here in the Philippines.
Thank you. And thank you also for the work that you've been doing in the relationship with the Philippine annual conference. And the work that they've done in crafting the Christmas Covenant. There's so many different plans that are coming forward, both from groups and from individuals. And again, I just want to reiterate that we're very convinced that our legislation is needed in addition to any other plan that might pass. We don't feel that our legislation is dependent on a plan or part of a plan, but that it would be essential for the church as it is currently structured, or in options of different structures. So that's I think that's probably the biggest point that I would want to make in this conversation. Checking through for some other questions that have come in. I do want to, in terms of the input from central conferences on our writing writing of the legislation, I want the connectional table is made up of every jurisdiction, has representatives from every jurisdiction, every central conference, and every agency. The connectional table has 49 members that are elected from the jurisdictional conferences, and also conferences in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And they're composed of clergy and lay representatives and a bishop that's selected by the Council of Bishops. The general agency top executives who are there with voice, and most of the presidents of the agency who have both voice and vote. And we also have youth and young adult representatives from the Division on Ministries with Young People, in addition to the young adults that are elected from their various constituencies. And we also include members from the denomination's racial and ethnic caucuses. So that's the connectional table's representation, and all who contributed to this writing of this legislation. And that includes, and that's in addition to the groups that Dale mentioned earlier, who participated in responses, which included West Path. Obviously, they were very involved in our legislation, but also the directors of connectional ministries in the jurisdictions, our legal counsel, Council of Bishops, the Commission on the General Conference Rules Committee gave us some help. The College of Central Conference Bishops were also involved in what we were preparing in the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. We met with them annually as we were preparing for the legislation. So that's some of the input there that we've mentioned, and I just want to make sure it all got into the one answer of a question. So we have a question about how many central conferences there were, and they thought that there were 3, but we actually have I believe 3 central conferences in Africa, and there are I'm not the best person to be here. Or Dale, you may have the better numbers than the European and the
3 in Europe, 3 in Africa, 1 in the Philippines. So I think there are 7.
3 in Europe, 3 in Asia, Africa, and 1 in the Philippines. So that's a total of 7 central conferences. We've had a question. I think, Dale, you've addressed this a little bit, but I'm going to throw it back to you. What some of the examples of global issues versus regional central issues? I know we put up some of the U.S. specific ones, but if you have some examples of how those might relate.
Global issues would be matters of our overall theology. Some of our polity matters. Some polity matters are really more regional or contextual. You know, things like salaries and appointments and clergy credentialing aren't necessarily always the same, or don't need to be always the same in all parts of the world. But matters of what we believe about faith and baptism and sacraments and our basic theological beliefs, our Wesleyan heritage, those are matters that are true for Methodists and Methodist followers wherever they are in whatever parts of the world. Some of the things that we would want to say about poverty and human rights and various societal conditions would be true globally, but other matters would be specific to situations that exist in certain regions of the world. There are societal problems that are unique to some parts of the world that aren't relevant in others. So those would be the kind of things I think that would differentiate between what would go to the General Conference and what would go to other bodies like the U.S. Regional Conference or the Central Conference. Today, for example, we don't have the same rules denomination-wide about terms of bishops and elections of bishops, but we have bishops universally. So, you know, there are a number of things that as people of the Methodist Communion we're going to continue to hold in common, and then there are many things that we in practice do and handle differently, if that's helpful in getting at that question. Thank you. Just one other thing. I mentioned earlier the draft of the General Book of Discipline. I think starts on page 731 of the second volume of the ADCA, and somebody who's interested in what the Standing Committee has identified as those things that are universal versus those things that are regional or adaptable. That draft is a very good start for the answer to that question.
And I believe their report will also clarify where they are in the writing process and and why the General Book of Discipline isn't quite ready, some of the issues that they've run into, and some of the actions that perhaps the General Conference will need to take in order to make their work more easily finished, so that it would be ready when we meet again. Okay, I have another question, and we do have the answer to this. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give a good answer to this here, but we do have it in our materials that are available on our website. And one of the examples are what are some of the items that central conferences have before them and have addressed, such that those items never needed to be put forward at general conference. I will say that some of our central conferences have completed their changes and their adaptations, that they have actual volumes of their adaptations to the Book of Discipline that are available to their central conferences, and we have copies of those examples of things that have been changed. Other central conferences have made the adaptations but haven't really written down what they are, so there's no real way for the entire church to know what adaptations they have made. And that's one of the hopes with the General Book of Discipline, that it would be much more clear what each area, each region or central conference is adapting and how that's adapted. I believe we have the Norway Book of adaptations available, and some of those things that they dealt with are educational requirements, are property changes that they've made to property, also local laws that might impact something that is specific to their area, their region, that is not necessarily specific to the whole general church. So those are some of the types of adaptations. For specific examples, as I said, we have some of them that are very specific, and others that that just operate in their central conferences that we don't have documentation for that.
One real specific area that I'm of course acquainted with is central conferences do their own modification and adoption of their pension plans. I'll be meeting with the Philippine Central Conference Board of Pensions in a few weeks, and when they want to make plan changes to their pension plan, they handle that locally. They don't send it to the General Conference. That's true everywhere except in the United States.
We had a question of why are we not hearing from Methodists in Europe, South America, and other parts of the world. I'm not sure if that question is directed to this panel in terms of the makeup of the panel. I will, we had a limited number of persons who were available to be part of the panel, but definitely our European central conferences have been very involved in our development of our plan through this connectional table. South America are affiliate churches, where they're not part of the connectional table, but that obviously their voice is available, is their general conference. So as for the makeup of the panel, we really did our best to try to get people who have worked really hard on this legislation and who are knowledgeable about it. But unfortunately, the whole connectional table was not available to us as panelists. I don't see other questions that are coming in, and so I just want to thank our panelists today. From my personal perspective, these persons have done so much to forward this legislation and have worked hard on it. And there are others. This is only a small representation of those people. So Denise Ann, I think, is going to ask us for some closing statements.
Yes, so we are nearing the end of our time today, and before we close, I'd like to ask each of you, what is the one thing you would like the delegates and viewers to know about this legislation? Feel free to answer.
I can go first. So I am a young person who is committed to a church that is fully inclusive of all people and allows for marriage and ordination of all people. But I'm also a young person who values the connectional nature of our church deeply. I have been deeply grateful for the ways I've been able to serve and be in ministry with United Methodist folks around the world, both through Connectional Table and through other ministry and mission opportunities, and also with United Methodist folks who don't share the same theology as I do. So I have hope that this is the next faithful step for our denomination moving forward, that this legislation will allow us both to help maintain our connectionalism while also resisting harm to our LGBTQIA and same gender loving siblings, which is important to so many people. And also it will just help us to stay together. And like we've talked about, this has been work of the Connectional Table for this full quadrennium. So like we've talked about, not everyone could be on the panel right now, but I will say that as a CT board member, we work really hard in our meetings to let everyone's voice be heard and to be really intentional about that. So like I said, I think that this legislation is a faithful step that has come out of really, really intentional and prayerful and collaborative work. So those are my closing thoughts.
And Adita, we're going to try you to see if we can get any sound, and maybe you'd like to type out a quick note. We'll read it if you can't get sound.
It looks like her sound's not working, but she did send me a chat saying, I would like the delegates to know that this legislation empowers the UMC to be truly global! Exclamation point.
Thank you, Benedita, and I'm so sorry that the sound has not allowed us to hear you today, because I certainly appreciate your wisdom and the contributions you've made to get us to this point. So, Karen.
Well, for me, basically, General Conferences tended to be very American-centric, and having the U.S. as a regional conference, as I've shared, brings us in parity in a way, where the seats are equitable. The voices of the U.S. will now be at the same level within the other central conferences. And this whole thing about anti-colonialism, I think it's the first step towards it.
And I would really echo what Benedita has and Karen have said, but also I guess my addition would be, I would hope the delegates would look at this legislation for what it is and not either anticipate that it can do things that it is not intended and not able to do, or fear it because of things that they think it might enable or might do. And not be jaded by previous experience or previous legislative efforts that may be related to this, but simply look at this proposal for what it is and what its purpose and intent is, and respond to it in that way.
Thank you. Well, I have a lot invested in this legislation. I have been personally involved in the development of this legislation since 2013, or in the preparation for it. Early in our conversations, we learned that there was legislation offered nearly 100 years ago that would make the U.S. a central conference. So this is not a new idea, but I believe that we may have found the best way to make a regional concept a reality. I've appreciated the input that we've received from the Standing Committee on the Central Conference Matters from the beginning of our work, that committee realized that this was important work that needed to be done, but it wasn't in the scope of what they were able to do, because obviously the task of preparing the General Book of Discipline was enormous. I appreciated their allowing us to walk along with them, as well as the input that they gave us at every step along our way. I'm excited about the possibility of a General Book of Discipline for the entire global church. This legislation is one way to make the new Book of Discipline be effective throughout the connection. And if it is able to help other ways through the various plans, then that's great. But I, again, will emphasize that the legislation stands on its own apart from any of the structure plans that have been offered. And that's the one thing that I would want for everyone to take away from our discussion today.
And with that, I'd like to say thank you to our moderator, Judy, and the panelists, Benedita, Michelle, Karen, and Dale. And thank you all for attending this live webinar. At the end of this webinar, please select Continue to take, that will take you to a survey. And in the next few days, you will be receiving an email with a link to the video recording. You can also see our legislation online here and continue the conversation using the hashtag USRC webinar. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.